Hello, this is Matt from Matt Teeny Apps. This is going to be a fun video. In this video, we're going to make an entire iPhone app using Xcode and SwiftUI. So that means we will make an entire iPhone app in under 35 minutes. When this video is uploaded, we have just hit December. So what better way of getting into the festive mood than by making this, a countdown to Christmas app. As you can see, it will look nice and Christmassy, and it will show this big number in the center of the screen that will show how many days we have left until Christmas. The cool thing about this app is that it will update itself every year. So as soon as Christmas has come and gone, it will start counting down to Christmas the next year. The way that we will put this app together, it will work on every iPhone screen size. So it will look like this on an iPhone 12, but it will also work on some smaller devices, just like this. All of the assets that we will use today, such as the images and the font, are free to use, and you can find the credits and the download links down in the video description. If you're a complete beginner to making iPhone apps, then you should be more than fine to play along with this video and make this app with me. But a little bit of Swift and SwiftUI knowledge will make sure you understand everything that is happening. I have introduction series to both of these areas on my channel, so feel free to check those out if you want, but they're completely optional. If you want to just jump in and make an app, then you should be good to go. If you love the idea of working along with tutorials to make full apps, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because in the new year, so in just a couple of weeks, I have a lot more of these series coming out, much bigger projects spanning across multiple videos. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I am really excited to make this app here today. So when you're ready, we have some coding to do, so let's get to work. So for this, I'll be using Xcode version 12.2, and you should be fine with any version which is 12 or up. So what we will do, we will hit create a new Xcode project. This will be an iOS app. Hit next. We'll call this countdown to Christmas. Now the really important thing to be set here is we have to make sure the interface is set to SwiftUI. The lifecycle will be a SwiftUI app, and because we're using a SwiftUI app here, this app will run on any device running iOS 14 or above, and the language is set to Swift. Hit next, and save it up somewhere nice and safe. When Xcode kicks in, we're just about all ready to go. Xcode will take us straight to the content view.swift. The content view will be the first view that will open when we launch the app. If this is your first time using SwiftUI, what we can do, we can create our UI over here in our code on the left and see this come together in real time in this canvas view over here on the right. If you don't have the canvas view, what you can do, select this option here and make sure canvas is enabled. To be able to use this canvas, you have to be running at least macOS Catalina. Whichever device we have selected up here will be the device used for our preview in the canvas. So for this, let's work with the iPhone 12. Once you have selected iPhone 12, hit resume to start your preview. This might take a few seconds, but eventually you will see Hello World over here on the screen. Keep a lookout for that resume button because it might pop up every now and then, and to see these live updates, you're going to have to hit resume. If you would prefer to use a simulator rather than the preview here, what you can do, you can tap this play button up here. This will run this code on a simulator. I'll be sticking only to the previews today, because in an app this simple, it's pretty much the exact same thing. If you do choose to run it on a simulator, the first time it launches, you might get a white screen. That is just your app kicking in. This is our preview. Now, when we code up our UI over here on the left, it will show in real time over here on the right. So, for example, as you can see, it says Hello World for now. This is because of this text object in the body of the view that's currently being displayed. If we was to change this, as you can see, the view updates in real time. We'll be able to see our app come together as we code it. But we don't want this example text object here today. That is just to kind of have something in the project when you make it. We're going to make everything that we want for our app. So let's delete the text object. This will leave us with an empty body object. The body is where we set up the view that we want to show on the screen. So let's start putting our app together. Let's break down how we're going to do this. So this here is our outcome. This is the Christmas app that we're going to make. What we will do, we will create a number of different views for this, so a number of different items that we can see, and we will stack these up one on top of the other. One way of thinking about this is that we are creating a number of views and then layering them on top of each other. We'll start with the first layer, which will be our snow down here at the bottom of the screen. We'll then add another layer on top, which will be our text objects, which will show how many days until Christmas. Finally, we'll add one more layer, which will be all of our Christmas decorations. It'll be the moon, it'll be the Christmas tree, and it'll be the snowman. So all we have to do is work through one layer at a time, putting each view on top of the other, and we will be good to go. So how can we do this? Well, if we want to work with layering views on top of each other, we need to use a Z stack. A Z stack will take a number of different views, so a number of different items, and it will layer them up one above the other. It almost works as the container for all of our views. There are a few things that we have to do for this Z stack, such as setting the background color to give our view the background color of the night sky. And we could do this now, but it's always a lot easier to do this and to see it happening when we have something in the Z stack. So let's add a layer in and then we come back to finish setting up our Z stack. So let's get to work on our first layer, which will be our snow, which will look like this. So how can we do this? Well, just like how we have a Z stack for layering views on top of each other, we can use a V stack to position views one above the other, vertically. What we will do, we will create a rounded rectangle object and then use a spacer to bump this down to the bottom of the screen. A spacer will just take as much room as possible. So into our Z stack, let's add our first layer. This will be our snow. Let's add a brand new V stack, like so. As we said, we need a rounded rectangle object for our snow, and we can initialize this with a corner radius. So there is also a standard rectangle object which would work well here, but I always tend to go for a rounded rectangle instead of just a rectangle. They're pretty much the exact same thing, but with a rounded rectangle, it gives you the option when you create it to have some corner radius. You can set this to 0 or you can give it a value. Honestly, to me, it's the exact same thing, but rounded rectangle has that instant bit of extra functionality. So I tend to always go for it, even if my corner radius is just 0. If you did want to have a little bit of a corner on your snow, you can do, but I'll set this to 0, so it just works as a rectangle. This object will work as our snow, but there's two things wrong with it. One, it's far too big, that's far too much snow, and two, it's the wrong color. Let's start by changing the height of this. What we can do, we can add a frame modifier to modify the frame of this, so to change the width and the height. And the only one we really care about is the height, which we will set to 100. If we don't set a width, it will just take all of the space available. Now it will make this white in just 1 second, but we will set everything else up first. That will then let us set the background color, so then when we make this white, we'll actually be able to see it. If we just set it to be white now, we won't be able to see what's going on. So as you can see, this is going to be our snow, but it's in the center of the screen, which will look pretty weird for snow. We want this down at the bottom of the screen. So in our V stack, above our rounded rectangle, let's add a spacer object, like so. Our snow object is now much lower, but it still doesn't look right. It's hovering. And that's because of the safe area of the device, where the screen starts to curve down here at the bottom. So what we can do, we can tell our view to completely ignore the safe area, which is good for now. It's just snow, it will be fine to drop this into the safe area. So for this, we need to go back to our Z stack, our overall container. Now that we actually have something in the Z stack, we can properly finish setting this up. This will include telling the Z stack to ignore the safe area, and whilst we're here, we can now set that background color. So let's add a modifier to our Z stack to tell it to ignore the safe area. So we can just say .ignore safe area, like so. Now straight away, the view that will be our snow is bumped down lower. But we still have this issue. If we was to make our snow white, we won't be able to see it. Let's now set the background color of our Z stack, which will act as the background color for the whole view, so we can then change our snow to white. This will need to go above our ignore safe area. So we will say .background, and we can pass in a background color. So we use a color object, and we will initialize this with the color that we want. And we will pass in an RGB color to make sure we get that exact color we want for the night sky. So we can initialize this, passing in a red, a green, and a blue. This RGB is 01451. But to make Xcode work with this properly, we have to divide each by 255.0. This happens because Xcode needs to work with a decimal point for red, green, and blue, rather than just a number between 0 and 255. For the green, we're going to use 14, and the blue, 51. Now we have that color we want for the background. It's our color for the night sky. Now what we can do, we can jump back in and set the color of our snow. So back to our rounded rectangle, we will set the foreground color to white. And just like that, we now have our container fully set up so it covers the entire screen, and we have our snow, and we are well and truly underway. So now on to our next layer. This layer will be the text, which will show how many days we have left until Christmas. This will be two different text objects. One that will show how many days we have left until Christmas, and one that will say the words days until Christmas. Because of this will be another V-stack, because we want one text view sat above vertically the other. So back into our Z-stack. Under our snow object, we will now make our text. This again will be a V-stack. And now in here, we can make our text objects. Now for this, what we want to do, we want to use a custom font. It'll make our text look a lot more Christmassy than if we was to use a standard font. So down in the video description, you will find a link where you can download this custom font. Once you have that, you're going to find this .ttf file. This is going to be our custom font that we want to use. So to install and use a custom font in our app, what we would do, we will drag this into our Xcode project. Really important, it's added to the target, so make sure this is ticked and hit finish. We now have our font in our project, but we have one more extra thing to do before we can actually use this in our app. For this, what we will do, we will go to our info.plist. Here we can say to our app, okay, take this font that we just imported into Xcode and prep it for us to actually use in the app. To do this, we have to add a brand new option here in our plist. So we're going to right click and we're going to go add row. This is going to be fonts provided by application. If you use a capital F, it should find it for you. Now we can open this up and we can list any fonts that we want to use. So here we can type the name of the TTF file. So this here has to exactly match that file name. If when you're watching this video, when you download that font, if the file font name is now different, you have to use your file name. So take this exact file name and put it here. It is case sensitive, so be very careful. If in a minute your font isn't working, chances are you made a bit of a typo here, so check back here. There we go. Just like that, we are now good to use this font in our project. Let's jump back to the content view. Now that the font is now ready to be used in the project, we have one more piece of information that we really need to know before we can use it, and that is the font name. Now this could be different from the file name, so it's really important to check this. So to find this, let's jump back to our TTF file. If you double click on it, it's going to open it up in font book. This here is the font name. So remember this as we have to use it in just 1 second. Sweet, so we're now ready to make our text. So what we do, let's make a text object to display some text on the screen. This will eventually show how many days we have until Christmas, but we'll handle that logic once we have finished putting together our UI. For now, this will say 365. If we hit resume and give it a second to build, you're going to eventually be able to see 365 in the center of the screen. It is black, so you might not be able to see it fully. So let's set this up. Let's start with the font. As we want to use our custom font, we will say font, and we will set a custom font with a name and a size. This is where we use the name of the font that we just found out. And we can pass on the size. Let's do something big, like 250. And as you can see, we now have our text using the correct font. We will give this a font color by using a foreground color modifier and setting it to white. What we will do, we will set a line limit modifier to make sure this only ever stays on one line. This is really important for smaller devices where if this text was a little bit too big, it might try and drop onto 2 lines. That would look awful. What we will also do, we will say if this number is too big to fit on the screen, which is a very good chance will happen on smaller devices, then to shrink the font down a little bit to fit. To do this, we will add a minimum scale factor. Now this has to go before we set the font. So before we set that font, we will set a minimum scale factor of 0.5. Our font can now, if it needs to, shrink down to half its size to be fully on display. Setting this at 0.5 should be enough because this number will never go more than 3 numbers. We are never more than 999 days away from the next Christmas. That is this text object done. So let's drop a line in our VStack and let's add another text object. This one is going to say days until Christmas. This will also use the custom font and a font size of 40. Let's make this white using foreground color and set it to white. We now have both of our text objects. There's a few things that we can polish off with this. To start with, I hate this big gap between our number and our text down here. This gap isn't actually being caused by any spacing between these two objects. It's being caused by too much padding on the top and the bottom of the text object that says 365. I think this is happening just because our font size is so big. There's a few ways that we can handle this. The simplest is just to squish the padding on the top and the bottom of this number. So back to our first text object. We will add a padding modifier right at the end, which will affect the vertical padding of this object. We will set this to -30 to squish it in a little bit. Straight away, this text here looks a lot closer to our number and it looks a lot better. The other thing I want to do is take this entire VStack and I want to bump it up the screen just a little bit. By default, it will be the very center of the screen, which to me just doesn't quite feel right. Especially when we have our snowman and our Christmas tree in just a little bit. It just feels a little bit better being bumped up the screen just a touch, in my opinion. So let's take our entire VStack and let's set padding on the entire object. This time just on the bottom with a value of 100. This will bump it up 100 points up the screen. It's a tiny detail, but I think it makes a lot of difference. That, for now, is our text layer done. As I said, we will come back to update our text value once we have finished our UI. So we now only have one real part left of our UI, and that is to add our Christmassy decorations. So let's break down how this bit will work. Remember, here is our outcome. This is what we're aiming for. So our decorations will look like this. Honestly, this is just using some simple images and some stacks. Overall, this will be a VStack. At the top, we will have a H stack with a spacer on one side and an image of the moon on the other. The spacer will be used to bump the moon to the side. Down the bottom, we will have another H stack, which will include a tree on one side, a spacer in the middle, and the snowman over on the side. We then have one spacer in the overall VStack to make sure the moon's at the top of the screen and these images are at the bottom. So let's put this together. The first thing that we have to do is get the images that we want and import them into our Xcode project. There are links down in the video description where you can get all of these images. So once you have your images, we're going to add them into Xcode by dragging them into our assets folder. So my images are here on my desktop. Do yourself a favor and make sure to rename these images something a lot easier to use, as we will be using the names of these images in our code. So I simply have moon, snowman, and tree. So let's grab these and drag them all into our assets folder. These are now imported and ready to be used in our code. Back to the content view.swift and back to our Z stack. So let's put together our decorations. So as we said, this will be a VStack. At the very top of this will be a H stack, and this is important, it's a H stack because we were using a spacer to bump the moon over to the right. So up top of the VStack, let's have a H stack, and let's make the image of our moon appear. Let's hit resume on the preview. So what we will say image, and we will type in the name of our image. Mine is moon. And as you can see, the moon is now appearing. It's pretty big, so let's resize this. To resize images in SwiftUI, we have to use the resizable modifier, which will tell SwiftUI that we want to have that control over the size. We're going to use scaled to fit. This will make sure the image will stay fully visible in the frame. When it comes to setting the frame, we're only going to set a height, and the width is going to figure itself out because we've used scale to fit. So let's add a frame modifier, and let's just set a height. The height I'm going to use is 50. We're going to add a small rotation to this, just really tiny. I think it just looks a little bit better at an angle rather than just being straight up like this. So we will add a rotation effect modifier where we can pass in how many degrees we want to rotate this by. I'm going to pass in -10 degrees just to give it that little bit of an offset. So we have the moon, but as you can see, it's really out of place. We want this over to the right and we want it at the top of the screen. So we need to add two spacers. The first spacer we have to add is to the H stack, which will bump the moon over to the right. So before the image in the H stack, let's add a spacer. You'll bump it across. Now in the V stack, we're going to bump the whole H stack up to the top of the screen. So after the H stack, within the V stack, let's add a spacer, like so. The moon is now in the top right corner. So the spacer in the H stack is pushing it over to the right, and the spacer in the V stack is pushing the whole H stack up to the top. The problem is this is now sat far too much in the corner. We can sort this out with a bit of padding. So back to the image. After we've done our rotation effect, let's add some padding to the top and some padding to the right, just to bring it back further into the screen. So let's add a padding modifier, and we can add padding to every side, but to get that complete control that we want, we can specify which side of the image to do some padding and how much. So to start with, let's do padding at the top, so dot top, with a padding of about 30. And then padding on the right, which would be the trailing side, also of 30. And as you can see, it just brings the moon in a little bit more. So we now have our moon in place. So the rest of our UI is now just our Christmas tree and our snowman. We're getting close to now having our full UI. So back to our V stack, underneath the spacer, we're going to add another H stack. Because of the spacer, this H stack will be at the bottom of the V stack, and therefore at the bottom of the screen. So after the spacer, one more H stack. And let's add our images. Let's start with the tree. So this image will be the tree, and there it is, looking gigantic. So let's add the resizable modifier to get that control. Again, let's use scale to fit, and let's set a height with our frame modifier. The height for this, I'm going to set to 250. We now have our tree in place. Again, I'm going to add a little bit of rotation because to me, it just looks too plonked in when it's up straight. I think that rotation just adds a little bit more character to it. So we're going to add a rotation effect modifier, passing in degrees, this time for the tree, -5. Just ever so slightly off. I think it makes it look better. If you disagree with me, feel free not to do that. Now, same sort of deal with our moon, where we're going to use a spacer to bump this over to the left. Because we want the tree on the left, we will add a spacer to our H stack after the tree. This will bump our tree over to the left. Now again, we're going to use a bit of padding to really get control over where we want this tree to be. So after our rotation effect modifier on the image, let's add some padding to the bottom of 10. And we're going to add a little bit of padding to bump this even further to the left. Like technically the image is fully up to the left of the screen, but because there's some transparency on the actual image around the tree, we're going to add some padding to just bump it over further. So let's add some padding to control this. So for this, what we could do, we could add some trailing padding to bump it to the left like we did with the moon. However, because we're bumping this off of the screen slightly to the left, I like to do something a little bit different. What I like to do if I'm bumping something off the screen, in this case to the left, rather than setting a padding of 30, in this case to trailing, I like to set -30 on leading. That to me will show we're bumping this off the leading side of the screen by 30. Whether you set 30 for trailing or -30 for leading, it's the exact same thing. It's just something I like to do to tell myself in the code that we're bumping this off of the screen. So padding on leading and -30 to bump it just off the screen to the left. It looks like it's just kind of tucked in on the screen, just like so. So now we just have one more image to do. This will be after the spacer in the H stack. So on the right hand side of the screen, this image is going to be our snowman, which again starts gigantic. So we'll make this resizable to get that control over the size. And again, exactly the same sort of thing. We're going to use scaled to fit. We're going to set a frame so we can pass in just the height and we'll let the width figure itself out. This will be 150. I think it's important, it's a different size to the tree. And finally, let's add some padding to the bottom. Bump this up just a little bit. So dot padding on the snowman on the bottom of about 20, just to bump it up a touch. And that, as quick as that, is the UI for our app. So now that we have our UI all set up and ready to go, the only thing that's left to do is to add a little bit of logic so that our text object here in the center of the screen will show the actual number of days to Christmas rather than our placeholder of 365. So at the moment, as a bit of recap, this text object will just always say 365. Let's add this logic. What we will do, we will add a function to our view which will figure out how many days are left until Christmas for us. Then all we have to do is say from this text object, call off that logic, get the result and display it here. So for this, what I will do, I'm actually going to close the canvas view for a second so we can focus fully on our code for this. Let's add the function. For this, what we will do, we will stay in our content view, but we will drop to outside of the body. So after the closing curly bracket for the body. Here we'll add our function, our block of code to figure out how many days there are until Christmas. So this will be a function which we will call get number of days until Christmas. This won't take any parameters in, but it will return an integer, a number, which will be how many days left until Christmas. And in this block, we will add our logic. So for this, there's two main steps. Step number one is we have to figure out the date for the next Christmas. So remember, this app doesn't count down to Christmas 2020 or Christmas 2021 or any set Christmas. It will count down to the next Christmas. So stage one is to figure out the date of the next upcoming Christmas. Once we have that date, all we have to do is take the current date and figure out how many days between then and the next Christmas date. So one stage at a time. Let's figure out the date of the next Christmas. So for this, what we will do, we will set up what are called date components. With date components, we can pass in, say, a month and a day, and then we can use this to tell our code to take a look at the calendar and find the next date which matches those components. So in this case, we'll have a date component of a month of 12 and a day of 25, and we will tell our calendar to find a date which matches a month of 12 and a day of 25. So what we will call this Christmas date components. This will be date components, and here we can pass in a whole bunch of information, such as month, day, year, hour, minute, and so on. But we don't care about all these, we only care about a couple. So we care about the month, because we'll be looking for a date in the 12th month, and the day. We're looking for the 25th day in the 12th month. Now what we're also going to do is actually add a time in here as well. If we was to ask our code to find the next date which matches this date, it will find midnight starting that date. Which doesn't sound that big of a deal, but the problem is it'll make our number of days left look off by 1. So for example, on Christmas Eve, it will show 0 because it'd be less than a day until the start of Christmas Day. But instead, we want it to say 0 on Christmas Day and 1 on Christmas Eve. The workaround for this is to find the date and the time of the very end of Christmas Day. So we can pass in an hour of 23, 11 PM, minute of 59, and seconds of 59. So we're going to use these to ask our code to go to a calendar and find the very last second of Christmas Day. We'll count down to that to get the number that we're after. So these are our date components. These are what we're going to give to our code to say, okay, find the next matching date which matches all of these details. When we're asking for this information, it's going to ask us for a date to check after. So for example, we could say find the next certain date after another certain date. But we don't want that. We want to start looking from right now. Let's create a brand new constant called current date. And this will just equal this date object. This will now store today's date. Now with our date components and current date, we can figure out the date of the next upcoming Christmas. So what we'll do, we'll say we'll call it next Christmas date. And it's going to equal. And to do this, what we will do, we will say, okay, let's go to our built-in calendar object. We get the current calendar for the user, and we're going to figure out the next date. This will ask us for 3 important bits of information. It'll ask us for a date to check after from, which will be the current date. So start checking from right now, effectively. We will ask it to find the next date matching all of our date components from here. And the policy, what we'll do, we will use strict. This will make it go as far into the future as possible to find the next version of this date. But it shouldn't have to look very far because obviously Christmas is once a year. So next Christmas date is now the date of the next upcoming Christmas. So if you're watching this on day of release, then this will be the 25th of December 2020. But if you're watching it in 10 years time in December 2030, I mean, to start with, that would be incredible. But the date this will now hold will be the 25th of December 2030. It will hold the date for the next upcoming Christmas. We can now use this to figure out how many days are between the current date, so whenever you run this code, and that date. The problem is that next Christmas Day is actually an optional value. And this is important for our code to work like this, because in theory, it might never be able to find this date. Now in our case, this will always be fine. It should be able to always find the next 25th of December. But what happens, for example, if we was to somehow put 13 here? It would never find a date that matches the 25th day of the 13th month. So this would return nil. So what we have to do, make sure this is set back to 12, because that was an example. What we have to do is safely unwrap this. So let's make this an if-let, an open curly bracket at the end of this, and drop a line. Now, if we can successfully get this information, which will always be the case in our case, this block of code is going to run. Here, we can now safely use next Christmas date. We can now figure out how many days until the next Christmas. So in the block from the if-let, we have another let, which will be called days until next Christmas date. To figure this out, what we will do, we'll jump back to our calendar, get the user's current calendar, and we will say .date components. We can use this to return the difference between two dates. Here we can state which components we want to compare between our dates, so we can just add to our list that we want to compare on days. The from will be the current date, so whenever this code is run, and the to will be the next Christmas date. This will now store the difference between our two dates. But because this is a date component object, what we have to do is break this down and we'll get the day property from this to get the number of days. This here now holds the number of days until the next Christmas. Now, just like next Christmas date, this is also an optional. So what we could do, we could add another if-let here, but what we're going to do, we can actually chain up our if-lets. So what we will do, we will say if-let next Christmas date equals everything that we need. We're going to grab this. Then we can add a comma to this and I'm going to chain these up. So it will now check both of these values, and if it can successfully get both, it will do the block of code. Let's drop a line to make it more readable. Here we go. So now this block here will run if we have successfully managed to get both the date of the next Christmas and the number of days until the next Christmas. If that's happened in that block of code, we will just simply return days until next Christmas date, which will return the number of days until Christmas. Now, this won't happen in our example because we're hard coding the date that we want to go to. However, we do have to handle the case if either of these values return nil. So if it can't find the next Christmas date, or it can't figure out the number of days until that date. What we will do today, we will just return 0, because in this example, it will never happen. If there was a chance, so say for example, you're giving the user the option to pass dates into this, what we would do, we would make int an optional, and then return nil and handle an error, maybe with an error message. But for today, because we're very, very certain that this will happen, we just return 0 to keep things nice and simple. So now all we have to do from our UI is call this function here, get number of days until Christmas. This will do all that logic for us to get the number of days until Christmas, and we just have to show that in our text object. So let's use this. Let's reopen our canvas view. Now, back up to the top to see where we have built our UI. Let's hit resume. Now, rather than just saying 365 in the text object for this, what we would do, we'll call off to get our number of days until the next Christmas, and we will add this to our string. To do this, we're going to do a backslash and brackets in the string for some string interpolation. Now, anything between these brackets, we can print in our text. All we have to do here is say get number of days until Christmas. This is now going to call off down to our logic, get the correct number of days for whenever this code is run, and display that in our text. Now, obviously your number of days will be different to mine. 26 on the screen is the correct number of days until Christmas from when I am recording this. And just like that, we have now made a fully functional, fully working countdown to Christmas app. And that is it. I really hope you enjoyed making this with me. I had a lot of fun making it, to be honest with you. I hope you stick around to check out more full app tutorials on this channel in the very, very near future. As always, leave any questions or any comments down in the comment section, and thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked watching this video, which I really hope you did, make sure to hit that like button, hit subscribe, and once again, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.